Hey, we're Saints. Father Chris here. Welcome to our Crucifixion live stream. Glad to have you beautiful people with us. A woman awakens late one night to find her husband is no longer in bed. So she puts on a robe and goes downstairs to find him sitting around the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and this really pensive look on his face. She says, "Babe, what's going on? Why are you down here in the middle of the night?" He says, "Well, today is the 20th anniversary of the day we met." A little taken aback that he notices that, she begins to tear up. And he continues and he says, "Do you remember that day when we first met 20 years ago and I was 18 and you were 16? "Yes, I do," she says. He goes further and says, "Do you remember when your dad caught us in the backseat of my car?" "Yeah, I remember that too." He says, "Do you remember when he put the shotgun in my face and said, 'Look, you either marry my daughter or I'll send you to prison for 20 years? She says, "Yeah, I remember that." He says, "Well, today I would have gotten out." Come on, that's funny. That's good stuff right there. All right, so we're going to use that silliness to get into the idea of marriage. Because, as we all know, marriage it's a beautiful institution, whatever they say. It's a beautiful thing when you have the right marriage. And so many people long for it, crave it, desire it, want to have a beautiful marriage. But it's become like slightly or way out of reach for many people. In fact, in this country in which we live today, the statistics tell us that 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce. Can you imagine? That's 50%. Like, what the hell's going on with people in their lives that they can't make this all work? Well, marriage is certainly not easy. Even more so, we see in the data that those numbers of 1 out of 2 ending in divorce are probably skewed because many people just cohabitate without ever getting married. So when they split, they're not even part of the figures, right? So it's telling us that something's going on in marriage. It's something we all desperately want. We want that perfect partner, that person who's going to complement us, the yin to the yang, right? Or in the immortal words of, Jerry Maguire, "You complete me," right? We're looking for that other opposite perfect half, right? I like to say a completely complementary, 2 halves of a completely complementary whole. Is that how I say it? Whatever. You get what I'm saying. We all want this kind of stuff. And the truth of the matter is, it seems elusive for many people. And usually, well, definitely, that's because people, as taking guidance from the world on how to be marriage, how to live within marriage, is totally corrupt and skewed and off, right? And even some people within the idea, look, I'm going to say it, even within churches, there are people out there, some of whom you may know, who teach that marriage should be like X or Y, and they've totally missed it. And they're making their own corruption out of it. That this whole idea of, bossy, war-hungry men versus trad wives. Maybe that works for some, but that doesn't necessarily coincide with what Scripture's saying and what we're going to go through today. So however you decide to function within your marriage is up to you. But there is one important factor that has to be there. It's essential for marriage to be a beautiful, healthy, blessed, awesome, fun, awesome thing. And that is simply this: to have a good marriage, you must live crucifixionally, right? That's the bottom line. There's no other way to do marriage right. There's no other way to do marriage that will produce a healthy outcome. And that's not my opinion, right? I'm proof of that because my wife and I both live crucifixionally within our marriage, and we've got an awesome marriage. It's not about what I said. I trusted it, tried it, baby, it works. And those words, that message, that understanding of crucifixional marriage comes not from I, but from St. Paul himself, which ultimately, as you know, for us as warrior saints, Scripture is the reference in all things. Chapter 5 of the Epistle to the Ephesians, verse 21, he starts, and look what he says: "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." So he's setting the context right there. And I'm going to talk through this a little bit. First of all, let's understand that the word reverence is a silly English translation. The word is fear, right? We don't want to ruffle any feathers. No, he says phovu, right? The fear of Christ. In other words, I'm telling you, says St. Paul, men and women, you should fear the Lord because he is the Lord. And because of that, you will subject yourselves to one another. In other words, you are going to put to death in yourself your own ego, your own desires, your own passions, your own wants, all those things in order to help the other person. And if you do this, though it may seem counterintuitive or oxymoronic, indeed it's the only thing that does work. And he continues in verse 22 where he says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife." Now, in a modern American context, this is ruffling a lot of feathers because we're women and we're independent and we can do whatever. Yes, you can, but don't miss his point, right? Don't miss his point. And let me take a quick aside. Look, I've got 2 daughters. You all know that. I'm raising lions. They're ferocious. They will conquer the world if they so choose, right? So it's not about the subjugation of women, but it is about their subjugation of their ego. right? That's the problem, because ego, when it gets in the way, puts you at the center. What Paul is telling us is that in order for your marriage to be crucifixional and Christ-like, you must be not the center. Your husband must be. So wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Put yourselves under them. It may feel uncomfortable. Absolutely it feels uncomfortable, right? But in doing so, you are putting the other person first. You are being crucifixional. Now, likewise, husbands are not going to escape from this, right? Because he goes on further and he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And again, in a modern American context, that may ruffle some feathers because what we have to submit and all he has to do is love. Look, don't lose what's happening here. How, he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? And he gave himself for it, right? I mean, he's talking about death on the cross. Do you understand that? So as wives must humble themselves to be under husbands, so husbands too must humble themselves to be willing to die for their spouse if necessary. I hope not, God forbid. But the idea there, you can see what St. Paul is saying, is that in everything you do, as a husband or as a wife, you must be sacrificial, crucifixional in reference to the other person. And I can tell you from experience, when you do it, it works. I've seen it in my own marriage. I mean, forgive the boasting, but I have the best marriage on the planet. My bride, I'm far, far, far luckier than she is, that's for sure. I don't deserve her, but nevertheless, she's a rock star. And because we're both willing to be crucifixional, it works. I've also seen that work in the lives of so many other people, countless people, where the husband and the wife are both willing to live crucifixionally. It works, and they have a beautiful and blessed marriage. I've also seen where one person alone is crucifixional. Still trouble. Still they end up in my office for counseling, right? Like, I've seen many marriages where neither the husband nor the wife have been crucifixional, but purely following the whims of the world and self-focus on everything they do. What am I going to get out of it rather than what do I put into it? And when they do that, they end up in my office for counseling. And sometimes, unfortunately, they end up going from my office to the attorney to file the papers, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm not mocking. What I am saying is that the sacrificial, crucifixional approach to marriage, it's the approach to life. That's what we as warrior saints, that's our thesis. But it applies most specifically and perhaps foremost in your marriages, because if the husband and the wife are willing to die and subject themselves to one another for the sake of that beautiful marriage, it will not be a good marriage. It will be a great marriage. Do you understand that? Now, I know that no marriage is perfect. Neither is mine. We fight sometimes, very, very rarely, but it happens, right? But the truth of the matter is, even in that moment or in those moments, we are able to work through because we are willing to sacrifice ourselves and our ego and our pride in order to make this marriage happen. So the challenge that I want to put before all of you today, look, you can seek, so those, some may be married, some are not yet married another way, others are still seeking the perfect spouse for marriage, and there are some who don't want to marry. Great, it doesn't change anything. The message is still the same even for all of us. But if you are married or looking to be or soon to be married, the truth of the matter is the world is telling you to do that in the same fashion that it tells you to do everything else, to look out for number one. The difference of the gospel, the difference in the call of the gospel is don't look out for number one. Look out for other. And here's the beautiful part. If both the husband and the wife do that at the same time, it will be a ridiculously awesome marriage, right? I can just tell you. I've seen it. I live it. Thanks be to God for all things. And I want that for you. To do that, you've got to understand how to think differently. You have to look at the world in a completely different and radical way, a different approach than what society, culture, socials, and all that stuff are telling you to look at it. You've got to look at things through a crucifixional mindset, a crucifixional lens. And you're not just going to get that for free. It's hard to do that because it's asking us, it being Holy Scripture, is asking us to think completely and radically different than the world, right? So how do we get that all and put that all in a nice, tidy box so we can live our lives? We'll help you do that. I mean, that's why we have our Understanding the Bible at warriorsaints.org. I mean, check it out. We are going to teach you what Scripture says about how to live crucifixionally. And here's where I end. And here's my promise to you. It's not a trite or silly promise. It's real, baby. If you live your life crucifixionally, if you let us teach you what it means to be crucifixional, and then you implement it and live it in your life, you will not have a good life. You will have a great one. Love you, beautiful people. We'll be back tomorrow. And as always, keep walking on the way of the warrior saint.